Okay, I have 12 o'clock. Welcome, everybody, to our lunchtime talk with Dr. Fernandez. Thank you for joining us for the Soul for Water um, talk today on adapted livestock for our regions and for our ranches. Um, I am really happy to welcome Dr. Fernandez. He is the interim dean of graduate studies and continuing education at the University of Arkansas Pine Bluff. He's also a livestock extension specialist and has been raising livestock, cattle, and sheep for about the past 10 years. He's got an awful lot of extension work in his history and writing publications and doing project work. Really happy to have him join us today to talk about the various breeds of livestock and choosing those breeds that are really well adapted to our farm's local environment in order to reduce costs and to prevent environmental losses. We know that we're going through some climate shifts and such, and that may have some impact on various regions of the country in different ways. And so I think this will be a really informative and refreshing discussion with Dr. Fernandez to talk about how we can think about the types of livestock that we're going to be grazing on our land. And if there's any adjustments or changes that we might look at in the future. So what I'd like to do is invite you to put your name into the chat and maybe what state you're in. And if you're raising livestock, perhaps what species of livestock that you are currently raising. Or if you're just beginning, and what species are you looking at perhaps raising on your farm? Also, as Dr. Fernandez starts to talk, feel free to type your questions into the chat. He's going to talk around 40 minutes or so, and I will be collecting all of those questions, as well as Linda Coffey, our program specialist in Arkansas, will be helping me to take those questions. And then we will have about a 15 or 20-minute question and answer session after. And that'll be a time that you can also perhaps ask your question live as well. So with all of those housekeeping items out of the way, I'd like to welcome Dr. David Fernandez and turn it over to you. Looking forward to what you have to say. You're welcome to share your screen, and welcome, Dr. Fernandez.
Thanks, Lee. So before I get started, I'm just going to take a moment because I was told that most people aren't aware of the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff and where we might be and what we are. We are an 1890 land-grant university, which is an historically Black university. They were set up back in the 1890s by John Morrill, or through legislation passed initiated by John Morrill, who decided that just because we had freed people didn't mean that we shouldn't educate them, and so the money was set aside for the states to build university or to enhance their universities. And in the southern states, because of separate but equal, we had the 1890s established, and so that's where I am. In southeast Arkansas, down in the Arkansas in the Mississippi Delta area, where the Mississippi River's kind of been wandering across this area over the millennia or eons to really provide some nice soils here, and yeah, it's a great environment to be in. So we're going to talk some today, and I hope that popped up correctly so that you're actually seeing the PowerPoint presentation about letting your farm choose your livestock, because a lot of times when we go into the livestock business, we have ideas in our head already about what we want to do and what we want to have. We've seen some kind of animal that we want, and they're really cute and fuzzy, and so we're going to have that one. Or everybody says this is the best animal on the planet, and we're going to go and get that one. We've done a lot of research, and we've decided we're going to get that one. Or perhaps we have in mind that we want to do something about a breed that's endangered, and we'd like to do something to save it and increase it in numbers. And that's oftentimes the way we think about what animals we should be selecting to put on our farms. But there are some things that we really need to think about other than just what we think we would like to have, and really need to think about how well they'll fit in the environment into which we're about to place them. And so I've entitled this, Let Your Farm Choose Your Livestock. because where you are and what you have has a lot to do with the livestock that are going to thrive in that area. And so, that did not work. Let me try that again with a different. Okay, let's try going to this here. Hear that. That. All right. Hopefully this one will work. Okay, it doesn't seem to be moving.
Maybe like hover.
There we go. Here we go. Here we go.
Perfect.
All right. So we have a problem on the horizon, and actually it's not on the horizon anymore. We're really seeing it coming, and that is that our climate is changing. And I really want to point out the fact that it's about climate change and not just about warming, because the reality is we're going to see more extremes in weather. We're going to see more flooding. We're going to see more drought. We're going to see extremes of heat and cold. We're going to see increased incidence of extreme weather conditions, whether it's larger, more powerful hurricanes, more frequent, more powerful tornadoes. We're going to see a lot of changes in the way our climate functions. And those changes are going to have significant impacts on the quality and quantity of forage that our pastures can produce. They're going to change the number and types of parasites and diseases that our animals are going to be facing. They're going to change our soil and our water management. If we have increased drought or increased flooding, when we do get that rainfall that might lead to flooding, we're going to see increased runoff. We're going to see poorer quality forage because there's not enough rainfall to generate that forage. We're going to have animals that are going to struggle with heat and cold. So a lot of things are coming along that we really need to consider as we move forward in agriculture, and particularly in terms of raising livestock. And so part of what we see is that we have this productivity versus environmental challenge issue where animals that are highly productive tend to be much more susceptible to environmental challenges. So, for example, high producing dairy cows are very susceptible to heat stress, whereas lower producing cows generally don't have as much problem with it. When you look in the background of this slide here, you're looking at the Edwards Plateau during a drought. Of the two cows on this slide, which one is going to perform better in this environment? And it's probably going to be the one that's less productive because there's not a lot of forage here and there's not a whole lot of water. You're going to have to do some things to survive in that environment. So adaptation is often at the cost of productivity, and survivability is often better in lower producing animals. They tend to have as production goes up, we tend to have a little bit of a reduction in efficiency of use of the property because their maintenance requirements are higher. It takes a lot more maintenance to keep that high producing cow in good condition as opposed to the lower producing cow. You also see an increase in generation of internal heat. So in a hot, dry environment, that high producing cow is producing more internal heat, and she's probably going to stop eating because that feed is generating that heat. And so we need really to start focusing a little bit on increasing the resilience of the animals that we do have and start focusing on breeding some resilience into the animals that we currently use in our production systems to help them deal with all of these applied stressors. And that's another thing that we have to consider. Livestock, animals in general, in fact ourselves, are not typically faced with a single stressor at a time. It's not just hot today. It's hot and dry and dusty, and there's not a lot of feed, and the water's a couple of hundred yards or a couple of thousand yards away where I'm going to have to walk to it. And so I'm walking to feed, I'm walking to water. It's hot outside. The feed's not as nutritious as it used to be. And so I'm expending a lot of energy to do this, and I need to go get in the shade and cool off. And so you have all of these stressors occurring at the same time. Or it's really cold out here and the wind is blowing and there's moisture falling from the sky and it's not frozen, it's penetrating my coat and it's wetting my skin. And now I'm really cold and I've got to find a place to get out of the wind and a place to get dry. And I need to eat something so that I can warm up from the inside. So you get faced with all of these challenges at the same time, and finding a way to breed some of that resistance or resilience to these environmental challenges into our livestock without decreasing productivity, at least not to excess, is really important. And we have to find that sweet spot where the susceptibility to environmental challenge, or rather the resilience to environmental challenge, actually enhances our profitability because it lowers our inputs and it enhances our animals' productivity because it can actually function in the environment in which we live. So I can't pick up my farm and move it somewhere where things are going to be better. I have to deal with the environment that my farm is providing me, and I need to select animals appropriately so that they are not going to be susceptible to those environmental challenges, that they're actually going to thrive in that environment. Because we're facing all of these environmental challenges, there are some things that we need to do. And so we need to be thinking about production adjustments. Because the quantity and timing of rainfall or snowfall might shift, we might need to start thinking about changing the timing of when we're breeding animals. We want to make sure, for example, that when our livestock calf or lamb or kid, that forage quality is actually getting better and not worse. We need to make sure that the quality is there so that they can start lactating and providing the best quality nutrition for their young, and at the same time maintain themselves so that they're able to rebreed later. We might start thinking about changing the mix of species that we have on our farm, because oftentimes when we see changes in climate, we'll also see changes in the plant community. And it's entirely possible that we might see an increase in forb types of species, what people typically call weeds, or brushy species. And so we might think about incorporating sheep or goats into a cattle pasture to help manage those forbs and those brushy species so that they don't completely take over the pasture and now we can't raise cattle. And so thinking about how we might want to mix species to maintain productivity, even though we might see a decline in productivity in one of those species because the number of species is higher and because they're taking advantage of different environments, we might see an overall increase in farm productivity despite a decline in productivity of one or another of those species. We also want to think about genetics to a certain extent. We want to identify existing breeds that are already resistant or resilient to that environment and start thinking about using them. We're going to want to think about crossbreeding animals rather than just straight pure breeding. And we were talking earlier, Lee was talking about some experiences he had out in Texas, and I had similar experiences in Florida where people would cross Brahman cattle with European breeds, and they would get the Brangus or the Brayford cattle, they'd get those F1 cattle, and they did much better in that environment because they were adapted to the heat, to the insects, and the drier, more humid, or the more humid climate, and did better than just the European breeds, the straight European breeds. We're going to start wanting to identify, and so from the science standpoint, we're going to start wanting to identify the genes responsible for reducing stress, so that we can try to enhance their function and reduce the stressors on the animal, so that the animal can be more productive. We're talking about doing things, from a functional genomic standpoint. We might want to start looking at how the impacts of environment and nutritional stress impact animal performance and things we could do to mitigate that, either developing new breeds or improving animal health, doing some things to improve performance. We need to think about enhancing soil and water management. We talked a little bit about, mentioned that a little bit earlier, where changes in climate, changes particularly in precipitation, are going to have significant impacts on soil because if it's drier, chances are we're going to have more bare soil. If we have a lot of drought, the plants in the community start to die. You have more bare soil. When rain comes along, now you have bare soil that can run off. And it's also not going to absorb as much moisture as we would like for it to, because even though that moisture might get into the soil, it's very quickly going to heat up again once the sun comes out, and that moisture is going to evaporate rather than sink down to a deeper layer and remain in the soil because there's no plant cover. As we see changes in the plant community, we're going to have to make sure that we maintain that plant cover of that soil, because the changes in the plant community are also going to impact the soil as to what the soil microbial life looks like and how that soil functions. And so that then comes back and impacts animal nutrition. So there are a lot of things that are going to go on there, and we need to start looking at, thresholds. What can our animals truly withstand in terms of heat or cold? Because we're going to see both of those things happen depending on where we are in the country and how that climate impact occurs. You could be in a very cold area that winds up getting colder, and you might need to understand that there's a threshold. Beyond this point, these animals just don't survive well here, and you're going to have to increase your management to keep them, or you're going to have to shift to another species. We want to make sure that, well, let's see, maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I'm going to go to this next one here. Well, nope, I didn't get ahead of myself. We want to make sure that we have appropriate housing. Animals need, well, maybe I didn't get ahead of myself. Shade and water and protection from wind or rain or sun. We need to make sure that those kinds of things are available. We need to put our management systems in place. Make sure that we're using, again, the right livestock species, and then making sure that we're properly managing our grazing lands. We talk frequently in this group about rotational grazing and how important that is, how it can enhance your forage production, how it can improve your soil, how it can improve the water retention capacities of your soil by improving the plant communities. But in a case where the climate is changing, we may also find that we need to reduce the number of animals on the property. And rotational grazing can help us to keep the numbers up, but it's not a panacea. We may find that it simply becomes too dry or too cold or too wet in the case of extreme flooding, where the soils become waterlogged for the soils to produce enough plants to maintain the number of animals we've had in the past, and we might need to start selecting for fewer animals on the property, even though we're maintaining that rotational grazing to do the best that we can with what we have. And then we also need to think about what we can do in terms of helping farmers to have the tools that they need to enhance their capacity to function in this changed environment. And so that involves training. We need to do more things through our extension services. We need to make sure that the research is in place that's going to meet the needs, the upcoming needs. We need to look ahead and look at the upcoming needs of farmers and be ready to have those technologies in place and have that training in place so that they can get it when they need it. We're going to need to have access to finance. Making these changes is not going to be cheap for farmers to do. They're going to have to really work to keep their productivity and their profitability high, even though they're going to have to maybe intensify their management or reduce their animal numbers or change their species and learn an entirely new management system. And so there's going to have to be some finance there. And then government policy as well. A lot of time, we all know how important government policy is to agriculture. The Farm Bill is always an enormous issue every time it comes up. And we need to make sure that the right policies are in place that will help farmers to adapt to the changing climate, which will include things like helping them to select the right species, the right breeds to put on their farms so that they can be more profitable. So some things that you can do right off the bat that are fairly easy to do and should be not too terribly expensive to implement. When you look at animals that you're going to put on your place, you want to make sure that they're properly adapted to where you are. So if you're in a hot environment, dark colored cattle tend to spend a lot less time grazing, and they spend a lot more time in the shade. They don't consume as much and they don't perform as well as lighter skinned animals do. Animals with shorter hair, slicker hair. So, down at the bottom, you've got hair sheep down here at the bottom, these Katahdin ewes. They've got that short, slick hair coat. They can dissipate heat fairly easily, as opposed to something where if you're in a much colder environment where you're expecting an increase in the number of severe cold weather, you might want something that's more capable of keeping its body warmth in with a woolier coat. When you look at the European breeds, they tend to be blockier, more muscular, thicker animals. And that's good for maintaining body heat. So if you're in a cold environment, you want animals like that. But if you're in an environment that becomes warmer, you're going to want something that's going to have more skin, more surface area. You're looking for something like this Angus bull over here, where he's got this extra skin that allows him to dissipate heat. He's got those long ears that help him to dissipate that heat. Another thing that they can do is they can sweat, which the European breeds don't do. They can pant, but they can't sweat. And so there are a number of adaptations that the Brahman and Watsutsi and Zebu cattle have that allow them to deal with the heat better than the European breeds, whereas the European breeds will do much better in the cold. So I'm not really going to take this Angus bull and move him up to Montana. They don't do as well up there. It's just too cold for them. But we may start looking at more of these Brahman type breeds, and we may start looking at some of the breeds that we'll find in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa that might be more useful as certain areas of the United States warm. Some other adaptations that you might want to look for, if you look over here in these sheep that we were looking at in the bottom, and these Barbados sheep over here at the back, you'll notice that they have, very long legs, and they have a fairly light body and a long neck, and that allows them, again, a lot of surface area from which to dissipate that heat, as opposed to the wool breeds, which tend to be a more square and thick animal, which is designed to maintain body heat. And so really looking at the animals, I'm not going to tell you a specific breed to choose, but I'm going to tell you, look at the animals that you're selecting and think about the environment you're getting ready to place them in. And do they have the characteristics that will allow them to fit into it well? Because if you take an animal that's designed to dissipate heat and put it in a cold environment, it's probably going to struggle. It's going to need a lot more management to keep it alive. On the other hand, if you take an animal that's really designed for a warmer climate, and I think Scotch Highlanders, I can't tell you how many times I see Scotch Highlanders in these southern hot, humid environments, and they don't really fit well here. So yes, they're cute and fuzzy, but I don't think they're terribly happy here. You need to think about shade. I can't tell you how often I've been at extension events on a farm and we've been out looking at the animals and looking at the forage, and we're all standing under the trees in the shade, and somebody will actually ask me, do cows need shade? And yes, we're standing in the shade for a reason, and they're going to go in the shade for a reason as well. So making sure that animals have adequate shade or adequate cover from the environmental impact, whether it's shade for heat, or whether it's walls and a roof for wind and precipitation in the case of a colder climate, where they need to be able to stay dry. Because that's typically the issue for colder climates, is being dry. Livestock tend to be okay with cold, but it's being wet and cold that tends to be the problem. So shade, shelter, something to keep them out of the elements where they can go and select it when they want to, and water, especially in hotter environments. Livestock need a lot more water, and it needs to be clean water that they can access readily. In fact, studies have shown that 800 feet is about as far as you want cattle walking to get to water before they start walking weight off of themselves. So every 800 feet, there should be some water available to them. And it needs to be clean water. We want to make sure that they're not drinking parasites and diseases, and that it's going to be palatable, that they're going to actually want to drink it. Another thing that I found in hot environments when I was down in Florida was that I was teaching agriculture at a high school. We had a steel water tank. And in mid-spring, that steel water tank would get so hot that you could not put your hand in the water. It would burn you. So the animals clearly were not drinking that water. And that meant they weren't really drinking it for at least half the night either, because it takes a very long time for water to cool. We put a shade over that water, and the temperature in that water dropped at least 50 degrees, because now all of a sudden it became so cold that you could probably drink it and be refreshed on a hot summer day, and you really didn't want to get into it because it was that cold. So in a hot environment, not just access to water, but also water that they'll actually drink, that it's cool enough that they'll drink so that they can maintain their body temperature. On the other hand, in a cold environment where things are getting maybe even colder, you might start looking at having uh, darker tubs, what am I trying to say? Darker water tanks that will absorb some of that sun's heat and have them in direct sunlight, where they're going to be more likely to stay open and not freeze solid or freeze over the top, so that the animals can actually access, and maybe the water will actually be a little bit warmer than ambient, so that it can help them to warm themselves a little bit when they drink it, because they still need water when it's cold. They just tend not to drink as much as they should when it's cold. Um, these things all help them to manage their bodies physiologically, especially water. Water absorbs a lot of heat, and it also allows them to dissipate heat. Because if they have enough water in their bodies, they can push blood out to the surface of their bodies and allow that heat to radiate away. In the case of Brahman cattle, that allows them to sweat, and so they can cool themselves that way. In the case of European breeds, they pant, and that's evaporation from the tongue. So again, water is a necessity for that. And then when it's cold, they need that water, because the water they won't be panting, they won't be sweating, but water actually holds a lot of heat, and it takes a long time to let go of that heat. And so that helps the animal to stay warmer. So between eating enough to generate the heat of digestion, and then having enough water to manage that digestion, and also to retain that body heat, making sure that they have water. So shade, water, uh, shelter from the elements, selecting animals that have the appropriate body shape and body characteristics to allow them to do well in your environment. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about when I'm talking about selecting animals for your farm. Size is another issue. Larger animals tend to do better in colder environments, and smaller animals tend to do better in hotter environments, because smaller animals have a higher surface to volume ratio. It allows them to dissipate heat, whereas larger animals tend to have a lower surface to volume ratio, which keeps them from dissipating heat. It allows them to hold that heat in their body. And you'll see this even, within wildlife. If you look at deer in the northern tier, they tend to be twice the size of large deer in Florida. I remember if a guy shot a 100-pound deer down in Florida when I was growing up, that was a big deer. Where when I went up to the Adirondacks in New York, those deer were 240 pounds. They were 2.5 times the size of the deer in Florida, and that was fairly average size for a good buck back then. So choosing your animals is not so much about choosing the breed. It's about looking at the characteristics, which are often in a breed, but looking at the characteristics of the animal. Does it have the shape, the size, and the adaptations to appropriately fit your farm? If your animals aren't currently well adapted to your farm, can you bring in different genetics just through breeding? You could bring in, if you're down here in the hotter climates, you could bring in Brahman bulls or Brahman semen and breed that to your animals and get that good F1 cross that tends to do better in the hotter environments. Or do you need to bring in, for a northern environment, something that's more along the European lines, which is going to give you a more robust body size and less of that heat dissipation that's going to allow it to survive well? Are you going to get the hair coat that you want? Or are you going to get a woollier coat when you're looking at small ruminants like sheep and goats, to make sure that they work well on your farm? And so there's a lot that we have to do yet going into the future in terms of research. There's a lot that we don't know about how animals are adapted to the environment, and how we can select among them on a more genetic level to get these traits in and maintain the production characteristics that we want. But we do have tools in place right now to allow you to do that, and some selection ideas that you can apply immediately to your place as we move forward and as the environment changes. So I'm open to questions at this point, and I know there are a few people on this call who know this little guy right here. And for those of you who remember him when he was this size, I thought I would let you know that he got married last night. So with that, I'll take your questions.
Very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Fernandez. I really appreciate the talk so far. We're starting to get a couple of questions in, and I'm just going to go ahead and read some off of the chat. But also, if anybody else has questions that they want to ask, feel free to put those in the chat. Or as we get closer, if you want to turn on your screen and actually ask the question, that would be absolutely fine as well. So let me start off right now with a couple of questions that are coming in. Let's see. So, David, what if I'm a beginner trying to decide among species? Any general advice about climate advantages or disadvantages of sheep versus cattle versus goats versus pigs?
So I tend to look at those from the standpoint initially of what I have in terms of grazing. You know, how much room do I have, and what do I have on the property in terms of forage? So, for example, when I bought my place, I came in with the typical animal science background in beef cattle, and I kind of grew up around them, and so that's what I wanted to do. But my place is only 20 acres, and only about half of that is pasture, and you can put about 4 cows on the place, and that's it. And that's not going to make you any money. And so I had to think about something else. And so I looked at the forage base that was available, and what I had was primarily grass and forbs. It had been a hobby horse farm. So there wasn't a lot of browse, and that's what goats prefer. And there was a lot of grass and forbs, and that's what sheep prefer. And so I went with the sheep. And then once I had sort of narrowed down my species, then I started looking at the breeds of sheep that were available and what I had and what I was trying to accomplish. And for me, I was looking at the fact that I'm in the hot, humid South. I mean, it gets very hot here in the summertime, and it gets very humid. It is not unusual to have 100-degree days with 97% humidity, and I can go outside and lose 10 pounds in a day, just doing mild work around the place. And so those animals have to be adapted to that. And so that's going to be hair sheep. It's not going to be a wool breed. They're going to have, and I want them to slick off very well. I don't want them to, because even within the different breeds, you will find animals that do things differently. In fact, we often say there's more difference within a breed than there is between breeds. So you can find animals inside of a breed that will often behave just like animals in another breed. So you want to make sure that you're selecting the right group of them. And I wanted animals that slicked off nice and clean, because you'll find hair sheep that don't. They'll maintain some of that woolly coat throughout their lives all year round. So when I chose sheep, I chose Katahdins because they're smaller, easier for me to manage. They do slick off really well, and they tend to be pretty well adapted to my environment. But had I been further north, had I been in northern Missouri, I would probably have started looking at some of the wool breeds, because it does get cold up there, and it doesn't get terribly hot. There'll be periods of heat up there in the summertime, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't last as long as it does down in southeast Arkansas. And so some of the wool breeds might be a little bit better adapted for that. If I were looking at browse and I were looking at goats, or further north, I'd probably be looking at some of the more robust, sizable breeds of goats that are thicker, similar to the Boers. They would probably work a little bit better in an environment where they're going to have to maintain their body heat, as opposed to some of the lighter goats that you might find that have come out of the Caribbean islands that are more adapted to a hot, humid environment, similar to the one that I currently live in. When I look at cattle, if I'm in a southern environment, and especially on a smaller farm, I'm probably going to be looking at some of the smaller breeds. I'm gonna want something that's maybe a low-line Angus, or I might look at, if I wanted to look at some of the breeds that are unusual or endangered, I might look at the belted Galloways, or I might look at Dexters, or something that's relatively small. Whereas if I were moving further north, those animals tend to be a little bit small. I mean, they're blocky enough that they probably do a fairly decent job of maintaining their body heat. You know, they're a fairly thick animal, but I might want something that's a little bit bigger that would be maybe able to maintain its body heat a little bit better in a more northern climate. Uh, and then also something that maybe has a little bit more in terms of a hair coat that maintains a thicker hair coat and maybe some darker pigment, darker skin or darker hair to help them stay warm so they can be out on a sunny day, even though it's cold, and absorb that heat from the sun.
Good, thank you. Another question, kind of related. Here's Beth Galante in Missouri raising Angus. So says she's looking for options, wondering what your thoughts are on the slick gene mutation. How can that relate to with selection?
So if I remember right, because I've been out of that arena for a little while, the slick gene allows them to really shed that hair coat and keep it off. You know, they stay, they don't get as the winter coat is not as thick as what it would be in your standard breed, if I remember correctly. And you know, again, if you're in a climate where they're seeing a lot of cold weather and where you might see more extreme cold coming along, because you know, like this year we've had a couple of very extreme bouts of cold weather. A couple of years ago we had some more extreme bouts of cold weather, and we may be seeing more of those. You might want to have something that's going to maintain more of its coat. On the other hand, if things are going to get hotter in your area, then that slick coat gene is probably going to be more helpful, and you might just want to make sure that you provide some management, like shelter from the wind and wet when it's cold outside, because really the issue with, especially with cattle, is that as long as they're dry, they can tolerate some pretty cold temperatures. They don't seem to mind that very much. But it's when you get things like sleet, freezing rain, or just rain and it's cold, and then wind, and they get wet through to the skin, that's when they tend to start to have problems. If it's snowing, that snow just sits up on their backs. They really don't seem to care about it. It might freeze into a block on top of them, but it's not touching them. And so that hair coat is maintaining that area of warm air between them and the environment, and they tend to do very well. We look out there and we think, you know, they're going to be dying. It's so cold outside. Look at all that snow and they're coated in it, but they're really, you know, quite happy in it. And part of that has, I try not to tell people to think about how you would feel if you're out there, because we tend to be sheltered. We have air conditioning and we have central heat and we stay inside when it's unpleasant outside. But there was a time period when I worked with hardcore juvenile delinquents in an outdoor setting, which means we lived in teepees and slept on the ground. And this was up in Pennsylvania. And in the dead of winter, I was perfectly comfortable outside, even though the temperatures were quite cold, because I lived in it all the time. And so they adapt to that. And oftentimes you're feeling like, wow, it's really cold. I need to do something for them, and they're okay. It's the wet and the wind. So if it's going to be hot most of the time and you only have to worry about occasional periods of cold, management. Give them the shelter that they need to keep them out of the wet and the wind. On the other hand, if it's going to be more cold in your area, you're going to want to think about maybe having a more standard type of animal, and then providing maybe a little more shade and a little bit more water for them for those hot periods when they need to cool off.
Yeah, and I think management is really key here. As you said, Linda Poole, right? She raises sheep up in Montana, and she's joining us today. She types in the chat an experience she has with her sheep in the winter, and having those heavy, wool blankets on them during the winter, and then having them sheared short in the summer. The flock has gone from -74 in the winter up to 113 in the summer, right? And it just shows you the range here just through adapting through management. So not only are it's selecting certain animals, but what type of management can you put in them? We've been talking about selecting particular animals and interactions with the environment and stuff. A question came in. Can you touch on epigenetics and the interaction between our husbandry environment and the animal's genetic base?
Sure. So epigenetics is the study of how the genes in your animal interact with the environment in which it finds itself. Okay. And so I'm trying to think of a good kind of classic example of epigenetics that might make well. Okay, well, the one that pops into my head because I'm a science geek is antibiotic resistant bacteria. Okay, we've all heard about them because we all have to deal with drugs and antibiotics and not really being able to use them anymore to keep that from happening. How'd that happen in the first place? Well, the genes were just there. But because there were no antibiotics in the environment that we had back before we discovered antibiotics, they never really got used and they didn't get passed around to the population. So every bacterium was very susceptible to penicillin when penicillin first came on the market. But the gene existed in the population originally. We just never saw it. And you see the same kind of thing, when you're looking at epigenetics. If the environment doesn't call for something, you may have the gene present, but you may never use it. All right. So we often get this idea that natural selection is incredibly efficient, and it isn't. As long as a gene isn't costing you anything, you'll keep it. And it can just sit there in the background for generation after generation after generation and do nothing. And then all of a sudden the environment will change and that gene will confer an adaptive benefit, and you'll start to see it increase in the population because those who have that gene will survive and produce more offspring than those who do not. So we saw that with bacteria, where those who had the antibiotic resistant gene survive and the ones who don't. And now penicillin doesn't work for a lot of things. We see the same thing if you're in the sheep and goat business, about resistance to dewormers. Originally, dewormers killed everything. 99.99% of the worms died, but it's that 0.001% that didn't, that had that resistant gene, that have now become so prevalent in the population that we're seeing resistance pretty much everywhere to every type of dewormer that we have. So you'll see the same thing when you're looking at your animals and what's in their genetics. You may not always see everything that they have because the environment you're in isn't calling it out of them. And it won't be until that environment changes that you'll see that change occur. So you may have already animals that are resilient to the environmental changes that are on their way for your area. And if that's the case, that's great. You won't really have to worry about that too much. But you're not going to see that until the change actually occurs. Those genes are going to sit quietly in the background until they start conferring an advantage. I don't know if that really answered the question you were asking, but
Yeah, and it made me think of something else too. It's like, we've been talking about adding, integrating new genetics into the herd, but given this phenomenon of epigenetics, can it help us to select from our own herd over time, or does this take too long?
well, so generally speaking, our own herds are going to be too small to make a lot of genetic progress that way.
Right.
Uh, you need a very large population for something like that to really work. So you're going to be bringing, now that's not to say you can't stay in the breed that you're in. You might, as we've seen with the slick hair gene, that's a great thing for southern producers because it helps the Angus cattle to be cooler. And so, you can find that line, those animals that have that gene in them, and you can breed that into your own and stay Angus if you want to. But oftentimes that's difficult. It's difficult to find and difficult to identify unless somebody's actually looking for it. And I don't know that we've been doing a whole lot of looking for some of these genes for a while. And oftentimes it's easier to look to an environment where these animals are already adapted and bring those genes in. The downside, of course, as I pointed out earlier, is that you often get a hit in productivity because that environmental adaptability often comes with less in terms of productivity. So there's going to be some shaking out over time about what we're trying to accomplish. And I know that the Brangus breeds didn't just pop up out of nowhere. That took time and effort. Somebody really concentrated on developing that breed. When we look at the Brayfords, that again is something that people took time and effort to create and then narrow those down to the ones that were really adapted to the environment, but that were also productive.
Good. Yeah, I just keep thinking about, like bringing in, new animals, what's the best way to do it, because there's so many factors here. Um, Christina Foster says that, in the Midwest, we're experiencing hotter summers and colder winters, but intermixed with warm days in the same winter. So not only do we have extremes, but we have this, we have this variation in temperature just all throughout the year. And I know I'm experiencing the same thing in Pennsylvania as well.
Yeah.
Um, you know, how would you choose an appropriate species or breed given, these types of extremes that we're seeing?
That's where the question becomes tougher. And, a lot of these changes that we're talking about are very long-term changes. So you're not always going to see like a year-to-year benefit to having this 1 year. As you point out, we're going to have very warm days, and this is an El Nino year, which means that we're probably going to be in much of the United States warmer and wetter. But then recent predictions indicate that we're probably going to very quickly switch back to a La Nina pattern toward the end of the year, where it's going to be cooler and drier. And so adapting to that is going to be difficult. Adaptations take place over longer periods of time. And especially right now during fluctuations, it's going to be difficult. You want to try to hit your best for your average. What are you going to see more often than not? And then the rest of it you're going to have to deal with management.
Mhm.
So if over the long haul, if you're going to have your place for 20 or 30 years and we expect to see a change, or if you're thinking about intergenerational change and you're expecting this change to occur down the road, you can prepare for that change with your animals. But as you're moving toward that day and you haven't really gotten to that environment where they're going to be at their best, you're going to have to help them with your management scheme. And so whether that's providing them additional shelter for cooling off or for staying dry and warm, it's not because there are so many different stresses occurring at one time. You're going to have to deal with some of it through management. You can't just do it all with selection. In fact, you'll do most of it with management and less of it because selection takes time. It takes a lot of time.
Mhm. Mhm. Right, right. Um, Another question came in, and this is about multi-species grazing. And, we know that, that goats like to eat brush and sheep like to eat, forbs and grass, and
Mhm.
cattle like to, you know, graze mostly grass. But I think this is a kind of a nuanced question here, looking at integrating other animals such as goats with cattle and such to be
Mhm.
helpful in managing, new plants that are coming up, right?
Mhm.
Due to climate changes. Um, do you think it would be helpful to have a mix of livestock as a way to mitigate some of these changes that we're having? And it also makes me think, are there any animal types that work best? In other words, can any breed or type of cattle work with any breed or type of sheep or goat?
So I haven't seen anything to answer that second question. I don't know that anybody's really thinking about it from a breed standpoint. They're looking at it more from a species
Mhm.
standpoint. And again, that depends on what mixing species is going to depend on what you see actually occurring on your farm. So if you see that you're starting to get species invading that you would find undesirable for what you currently have on your farm, then it would be a good idea to incorporate something that will eat that to help manage it. And you may find you don't want to eliminate it, you may just want to manage it. Because if you look at uh, cattle and sheep grazing together, for example, you can graze 2 sheep for every cow on your place in some research that's been done and not change the productivity of your cattle. But now you've got some sheep to sell as well. Now, the downside to that is you have to have different management facilities because you can't work cattle in sheep and goat facilities. And if you're working sheep and goats in cattle facilities, they can often slide through the bars. And especially the youngsters, that was a real problem for me when I first got on my place because the panels were set up for cattle. So I just put some mesh wire on the insides of those and eliminated the problem. But the facilities are different. So there's that expense that comes along with the different revenue stream. But if you're just seeing grasses and the grasses are changing, but they're not really changing, you're not seeing an invasion of something that would require a different species. If you want to continue with a single species, that's fine. But I like multi-species grazing anyway, because it will give you that additional revenue stream if your expenses don't get too far out of hand. And it's a way to better utilize your operation and be more efficient uh, with what you have, because the sheep, for example, will go through, you should send them through first because they have higher maintenance requirements, or you can have them together. Uh, they have higher maintenance requirements, and so that they are more selective, and then the cows just kind of clean up everybody behind them. And yes, Linda, you're right. Diversity is nature's way, and that does help to make things better on your property. And one of the stories that I've always liked, and I know a couple of people on the call or remember Ron Morrow, but Ron told me a story one time about his early days when they were doing a study with cattle and sheep together, and everybody said they'll never graze together. You know, it's just going to be awful. The sheep are going to graze over here, the cows are going to graze over there, and they won't graze together. And initially, that is the way it started out. The sheep avoided the cows avoided the sheep. But at the end of the study, they were grazing together, and then some bright person in the group noticed something even better. Not only were they grazing together, but the sheep were quite literally standing in the shadows of the cows and grazing in the shade the entire time they were out grazing. So the sheep were taking care of their shade issue with the cows, and the cows just had to stand out there and suck it up. So there's that adaptability as well.
Yeah, I think we know a lot about multi-species grazing and the benefits that we can get from it, with, dietary differences and overlap and such. Kathy Noble's writing about here about living in central Idaho and, dealing with Dalmatian toad flax and, rush skeleton weed and and spotted knapweed and such. And wondering what species to reseed for that, right? For goats and chickens. But I always like to think, let's let the animals do the work first. Um, Goats and sheep will definitely eat knapweed. They'll definitely eat rush skeleton weed at certain stages of their life. I've seen them do it. They'll eat Dalmatian toad flax, but I would be very cautious with allowing cattle to graze toad flax because there is a poison that affects cattle more than it does sheep on the toad flax. So I like to I like to utilize animals to try to change the landscape as much as possible, and reseed, only if we really, really have to. Let's see, do we have any more questions coming in? Here's one about mineral supplementation that came in. Wondering about mineral supplementation, the idea of using mineral buffets versus using the best available commercial mineral mix versus using a nutritionist and getting a custom mix based on forage and water analysis. So looking at minerals and again, the amount of management and attention you're going to put into it, what do you think is the best way to go?
Anytime you ask somebody like me what is best, I'm always going to answer the same thing, and we all do it.
Yeah,
I'll say it depends.
it depends.
Yeah, it depends. But especially in the case of minerals, mineral nutrition is incredibly complex, and minerals interact with one another in terms of how they're absorbed. So if you have too many divalent cations in the mix, so magnesium and calcium, they have a +2 positive charge. They tend to interfere with each other in their absorption. And so if you have too much of one, the other one doesn't get absorbed properly. And same thing with a lot of other ions in the mix that we put together. And so nutrition companies hire a lot of mineral nutritionists who specifically work on mineral nutrition to develop the mixes that they have. And I spoke to one of them at a meeting some years ago who is a mineral nutritionist at a nutrition company, and the amount of work they do to put those mixes together to make sure that your animals not only get what they need to have, but that there's not something in there that's going to actually interfere with the absorption of the others so that they actually get what they need to have and that they can digest it, they can absorb it. That's very difficult for you to do as an individual. And like a mineral buffet where you're putting out several different types of mineral for them where they can kind of come along and self-select. Because minerals are required usually in such tiny quantities, it's difficult for them to select just what they need. I mean, we're talking about microgram levels, which is a few thousandths of a milligram. And you know how tiny a milligram is, it's just pixie dust. It's really all it is. And as soon as they stick their tongue on it, they've gotten a month's supply of the stuff, but they're going to stand there and eat a little bit of it. And so finding a nutritionist to mix your own, mineral nutrition is so complex, most nutritionists don't really do it. They leave that to a small number of specialists, and most of those people really do work for the supplement companies. So in that case, if it makes you happy and it makes you feel like you've really, and if you're in an area where there's a specific lack, like if you know that your area is really deficient in selenium, then of course you're going to need to supplement selenium, but we have ways of doing that that don't necessarily involve changing a mineral mix. You can supply it with an injectable, or you can top dress some on periodically to make sure that they have enough. But for the most part, I'm really in favor of letting the mineral nutritionists handle it and not doing it on my own so much. I've not had difficulties maintaining mineral needs of my livestock with just a standard mineral mix. Now, I will say when you're doing multi-species grazing, copper is the issue if you have sheep. So the mineral that you provide has to be very low in copper, and that's not going to be enough for goats and cattle. And you'll have to provide them with a separate supplement, either through a drench or through a supply of copper that the sheep cannot get into so that they meet their copper needs. So that's where you run into an issue between sheep and the others. But other than that, that's kind of where I stand on that issue. That's more personal than anything else.
Good. Well, yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, we've had some pretty good questions. The talk was amazing. I always learn a lot whenever I come to these webinars. And again, appreciate you, Dr. Fernandez, for coming and speaking with us today. I'll give a chance for anybody else who might want to ask a quick question in the chat, but I'm going to kind of touch on, let's see, our next webinar, which will be Thursday, March 14th. We're going to have Tony and Lavana Ukeman from Arkansas, and I hope I got that name correctly. Maybe Linda can correct me if I got it wrong. But they're going to give their reflections on 30 years of grazing in Arkansas. That'll be at 11 Central on Thursday, March 14th coming up. So save the date for that. It'd be really good to hear what they're doing. Check the chat one more time. Got a lot of thank yous. I think we did. Yes, we did learn an awful lot today. Really appreciate you, Dr. Fernandez. It's 12:58. Appreciate you taking the time. And yeah. Any final thoughts, Mike or Linda or anything as we kind of transition out and look forward to the next session?
I would like to say thank you again, Dr. Fernandez. Thanks for an interesting presentation, and just encourage everybody to select the animals on your place to be, sorry, to be good performers.
We have a visitor. That happens a lot when our offices are in our home. With me, it's usually my cat's tail coming right here like this in front. So once again, thank you, Dr. Fernandez. Really appreciate you. This will be recorded. This was recorded, so it will be available on our Soil for Water website for anybody who would like to look at it later. Share it with your friends and family. And also let people know about these monthly webinars that we have with Soul for Water, bringing in researchers and producers and such from across the country to talk about things on our Thursday lunch period. Share that with your folks and let them know what's going on as well. So other than that, yes?
I would say, please do come March 14th. Tony and Lavana Ekman are wonderful members of our Soul for Water network. They have been grazing, as you said, for over 30 years. They have learned a lot. They were also both previously with NRCS, and they have a world of experience about programs and about ways that you can get some financial help to build out the infrastructure for your farm to manage your soils better. And they're going to be great. So March 14th, please do come.
Good. Thank you, Linda. Look forward to that. And thank you, Lutz, for taking care of all of the behind the scenes for this. Really appreciate you as well. And so it's 1 o'clock, and I will thank you again, and we'll see you next month at this time.
Alrighty, thank you, Lee. Bye.
Bye.